The morning sun cast long shadows across Camp Pendleton as Master Sergeant Rodriguez wiped the sweat from his brow. For the third consecutive day, his elite sniper team had failed to hit targets that should have been routine kills. The frustration was eating away at him like acid. "Sir, we've got a problem," called out Corporal Hayes, emerging from the observation post with his spotter's scope slung over his shoulder. His usual confidence had been replaced by something Rodriguez hadn't seen in years of combat deployments: doubt. The targets were positioned at varying distances across the valley: 800 meters, 1,000, 200 meters, and 1,500 meters. Standard engagement ranges for Marines who had successfully completed dozens of missions in Afghanistan and Iraq. These weren't moving targets or adverse weather conditions. The wind was minimal, visibility was crystal clear, and their equipment had been thoroughly inspected by the armory. Yet somehow, round after round sailed past the designated marks. Rodriguez gathered his four-man team around the tactical table inside the command tent. Each Marine represented the pinnacle of military precision: Staff Sergeant Chen, with his legendary steady hand; Sergeant Williams, who could calculate wind drift in his sleep; Corporal Hayes, whose spotting abilities were unmatched; and Private First Class Thompson, the youngest but most naturally gifted marksman Rodriguez had encountered in 20 years of service. "Gentlemen, we've been at this for 72 hours, Rodriguez began, his voice carrying the weight of accumulated failure. "Command has been breathing down my neck because we're supposed to be demonstrating our capabilities to visiting NATO observers next week. Instead, we're missing shots that boot camp graduates should be making." Staff Sergeant Chen leaned back in his chair, running his fingers through his close-cropped hair. "Sir, I've checked and rechecked everything. Scope mounting, barrel condition, ammunition, consistency. My rifle is zeroed perfectly at the range. But out there," he gestured toward the valley, "it's like something's throwing off our calculations." The team had methodically eliminated every variable they could control. They had switched rifles, changed positions, adjusted for every environmental factor in their training manuals. The ammunition had been inspected lot by lot. The scopes had been re-zeroed multiple times. Even the shooting positions had been surveyed for level ground and optimal angles. Sergeant Williams pulled out his weathered notebook, filled with detailed calculations and observations. "Sir, I've been tracking every shot. The pattern isn't random. Each miss is consistently off by the same margin, but in different directions depending on which target we're engaging. It's almost like there's some kind of systematic error we can't identify." Private Thompson, who rarely spoke during briefings, finally broke his silence. "Permission to speak freely, sir?" Rodriguez nodded. "I grew up hunting in Montana, and my grandfather taught me that sometimes the problem isn't with the shooter or the equipment. Sometimes it's with understanding the environment in ways that instruments can't measure." The comment hung in the air as the team contemplated their situation. These weren't ordinary soldiers struggling with basic marksmanship. They were elite warriors who had successfully engaged enemy combatants under extreme stress in some of the world's most challenging environments. The psychological toll of repeated failure was beginning to affect their confidence, which, in combat, could mean the difference between life and death. Outside the tent, the daily routine of the base continued. Marines jogged past in formation. Vehicles moved, equipment between buildings, and the constant hum of military life provided a backdrop to their crisis. Among these everyday activities, few people paid attention to the man pushing a maintenance cart between the various facilities. His name was Eddie Kowalski, and officially he was employed by the civilian contractor responsible for base maintenance and janitorial services. At 62 years old, Eddie moved with the deliberate pace of someone who had learned that steady progress was more valuable than rushing. His gray hair was always neatly combed. His work uniform was clean and pressed, and he approached every task with the same methodical attention to detail. What most people on the base didn't know was that Eddie had served 2 tours in Vietnam as a Marine sniper in the late 1960s. He had left the Corps in 1971 and spent the following decades working various jobs: construction, factory work, security guard, before settling into his current position 5 years ago. He never talked about his military service, and his personnel file listed only his civilian work history. Eddie had noticed the sniper team's struggles over the past few days. Their practice sessions were conducted in an area visible from several of the buildings he maintained, and he couldn't help but observe their repeated attempts and obvious frustration. Something about their situation reminded him of challenges he had faced decades ago in the jungles of Southeast Asia, where success often depended on understanding factors that weren't covered in any manual. The truth was that Eddie had never stopped being a sniper. His eyes still automatically calculated distances and wind conditions wherever he went. He noticed details that others overlooked, the way shadows fell differently at various times of day, how temperature changes affected air density, the subtle effects of terrain features on bullet trajectory. These habits had become so ingrained that he practiced them unconsciously, like a musician who continues to hear melodies in everyday sounds long after leaving the concert hall. As Eddie cleaned the windows of the observation building, he found himself studying the same targets that had been frustrating the Marine team. From his elevated position, he could see the entire valley spread out below. The targets appeared as small dark squares against the lighter background of the hillside, positioned at the prescribed distances for the training exercise. But Eddie's experienced eye caught something that the Marines, focused intensely on their equipment and procedures, had missed. The valley's geography created a unique microclimate that changed throughout the day. The morning sun heated the eastern slope differently than the western slope, creating subtle air currents that weren't detectable by standard weather instruments. These thermals, invisible and constantly shifting, were causing the minute deflections that threw off even perfectly aimed shots. Eddie remembered similar conditions from a mission near Da Nang in 1969, where his unit had struggled for days to eliminate a North Vietnamese sniper who had been picking off American soldiers. The enemy marksman was positioned in a location where conventional sniping wisdom suggested he should have been an easy target. But somehow, he remained elusive. It wasn't until Eddie spent hours observing the area without trying to shoot that he noticed the pattern of heat distortion rising from a nearby rice paddy. The realization that history was repeating itself brought a slight smile to Eddie's weathered face. He finished cleaning the windows and moved on to his next task. But throughout the rest of his shift, he found himself thinking about the frustrated Marines and wondering if there was a way to help them without revealing his own background. That evening, Eddie sat in his small apartment off base, considering his options. He had spent 40 years keeping his military service private, partly because the memories were painful, and partly because he preferred the anonymity of his current life. But watching young Marines struggle with a problem he could solve felt like a betrayal of the brotherhood he had once been part of. The next morning brought another day of failed attempts for Rodriguez and his team. The pressure from command was increasing, and Rodriguez could see the confidence draining from his Marines with each missed shot. They had expanded their analysis to include factors that seemed increasingly desperate: electromagnetic interference from nearby equipment, subtle variations in the Earth's magnetic field, even the possibility that their targets had been moved slightly from their original positions. Eddie arrived at work as usual, but instead of beginning his regular cleaning routine, he made an unusual decision. He approached the command tent, where he could hear the voices of the frustrated sniper team discussing their latest failures. Taking a deep breath, he knocked on the frame of the tent entrance. "Excuse me, sir," Eddie said to Master Sergeant Rodriguez. "I'm Eddie from maintenance. I couldn't help but notice you folks have been working on some kind of training exercise. I was wondering if I might have a word with you about the shooting conditions in that valley." Rodriguez looked up from his maps and calculations, initially irritated by the interruption. "I'm sorry, but we're dealing with some technical issues right now. If there's a maintenance problem, you'll need to submit a work order through the proper channels." Eddie shifted his weight slightly and spoke quietly. "Sir, I'm not here about maintenance. I spent some time in Vietnam, and I've been watching your team work. I think I might know what's causing your problems." Rodriguez studied Eddie's face carefully, noting the calm confidence in his eyes and the way he held himself despite his civilian clothes and maintenance equipment. Something about the older man's demeanor suggested he wasn't just another base employee offering unsolicited advice. "Vietnam?" Rodriguez asked, his tone shifting from irritation to curiosity. "What unit were you with?" "Under 1st Battalion, 3rd Marines, sir. Scout Sniper Platoon from 68 to 71. Eddie's voice carried no pride or boastfulness, just the matter-of-fact tone of someone stating a simple truth. Staff Sergeant Chen looked up from his rifle cleaning kit, suddenly interested. The entire sniper team had grown quiet, recognizing that they were in the presence of someone who had walked the same path they now traveled, only under conditions far more dangerous than any training exercise. Rodriguez gestured to an empty chair. "Please, sit down. Tell me what you've observed." Eddie settled into the chair and glanced around at the maps, weather data, and ballistic charts scattered across the table. "Sir, your calculations and equipment look perfect. The problem isn't with what you're doing, it's with what you can't see. That valley creates thermal layers that change throughout the day. The sun hits those hillsides at different angles, creating air currents that your instruments can't detect." Private Thompson leaned forward eagerly. "You can see heat distortion from this distance?" Eddie shook his head. "Not exactly see it, son. But after enough time, you learn to read the signs. Watch how the shadows move across the valley floor. Notice where vegetation grows differently on the slopes. Those little details tell you about air movement patterns that affect bullet trajectory in ways that ballistic computers can't calculate." Sergeant Williams flipped through his notebook. "We've been accounting for wind speed and direction using standard meteorological data. That's good for general conditions," Eddie replied. "But in a valley like this, you've got microclimates within microclimates. The eastern slope heats up first in the morning, creating rising air currents. The western slope stays cooler longer, creating different pressure patterns. Where those air masses meet, you get invisible turbulence that can push a bullet off course by several inches at long range." The team exchanged glances, recognizing the logic of Eddie's explanation even though it contradicted everything they had been taught about environmental factors in sniper training. Modern military doctrine relied heavily on technological solutions and standardized procedures, but what Eddie was describing required the kind of intuitive understanding that only came from extensive field experience. Rodriguez made a decision that would have surprised his superiors. "Eddie, would you be willing to show us what you're talking about? Maybe take a look at our shooting positions and see if you can identify the specific problems we're facing?" Eddie nodded slowly. "I'd be honored to help, sir. But I should mention that I haven't fired a rifle in over 40 years. My shooting days are long behind me." 20 minutes later, the group made their way to the sniper positions, overlooking the valley. Eddie moved with surprising agility for his age, and Rodriguez noticed that he automatically took cover behind terrain features and avoided skylining himself against the ridge habits that never really disappeared once learned. At the primary shooting position, Eddie spent several minutes simply observing without touching any equipment. He watched the way morning light played across the valley, noted the direction of barely perceptible air movements indicated by the behavior of birds and insects, and studied the terrain with eyes that had been trained to see what others missed. "Staff Sergeant Chen, you've been trying for the target at 800 meters first each morning, correct?" Eddie asked. Chen nodded, surprised by the accuracy of the observation. "Yes, sir. We always engage the closest target first, then work our way out to longer ranges. That's your first problem," Eddie explained. "At this time of day, the thermal currents between here and that target are the most unstable. The air is still settling into its daily patterns. If you wait until mid-morning, when the sun has been on both slopes for a couple hours, those currents will stabilize and become predictable." Eddie pointed toward the 1,200-meter target. "That position is actually your best bet for early morning shots. The terrain features there create a natural wind channel that stays relatively consistent. The air flows up the valley in a predictable pattern that you can compensate for." Private Thompson raised his hand tentatively. "What about the longest target, the one at 1,500 meters?" Eddie smiled slightly. "That's the tricky one. Late afternoon is your best window for that shot. The way the mountains shadow that section of the valley creates a temperature inversion around 1400 hours. The cooler air settles into the low ground, giving you a clear, stable shooting corridor for about 30 minutes. Sergeant Williams was frantically taking notes. "How do you know all this? I mean, how can you tell just by looking?" 40 years of thinking about it," Eddie replied honestly. "When I got home from Vietnam, I couldn't stop analyzing terrain and weather patterns. It became a habit. Like some guys who come back and can't stop watching doorways and checking corners. I've been unconsciously reading this valley every day for 5 years. While doing my maintenance rounds, Rodriguez felt a mixture of admiration and frustration. Here was knowledge that could revolutionize his team's capabilities, but it came from sources that weren't part of any official training program. Eddie, what you're describing, is this something that can be taught? Or does it require decades of experience to develop? Both, sir. The basic principles can be learned fairly quickly if you know what to look for. But developing the instinct to apply those principles automatically under stress, that takes time and practice. Staff Sergeant Chen had been quiet during most of the conversation, but now he spoke up. Sir, request permission to test this theory. I'd like to try the 1,200-meter target first. Using Eddie's recommendations for reading the wind, Rodriguez checked his watch. It was nearly 10 in the morning, approaching the time window Eddie had suggested. Permission granted. But let's do this systematically. Eddie, walk us through exactly what you're seeing and how you're interpreting it. For the next hour, Eddie provided a masterclass in environmental observation that was unlike anything the Marines had experienced in their formal training. He showed them how to use peripheral vision to detect heat shimmer, how to interpret the behavior of dust and debris to understand air currents, and how to correlate temperature variations with topographical features. The key, Eddie explained as Chen prepared for his shot, is not to overthink it. Your instruments will give you the baseline data. But then you need to trust your eyes and your instincts to make the final adjustments. Chen settled into his shooting position. But instead of immediately acquiring the target through his scope, he spent several minutes simply observing the valley with his naked eye. Applying Eddie's techniques, then he made subtle adjustments to his scope settings based on what he had observed. The shot broke cleanly, and through his spotting scope, Williams called out, "Hit! Dead center!" The excitement in Williams' voice was unmistakable. After 3 days of consistent failures, they had finally achieved a successful engagement, but more importantly, they had learned a new way of understanding their environment that promised to make them more effective snipers. Rodriguez felt a surge of relief mixed with professional curiosity. Eddie, I have to ask, with all this knowledge and experience, why are you working as a janitor? Have you ever considered sharing these skills in a more formal capacity? Our work. Eddie was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. Sir, after Vietnam, I just wanted to live a quiet life. I've been happy staying in the background, doing honest work, and keeping to myself. But watching your Marines struggle with something I could help with, it didn't feel right to stay silent. Corporal Hayes, who had been listening intently to the entire conversation, finally spoke up. Eddie, would you be willing to stick around for the rest of our training session? Maybe help us understand how to apply these techniques to the other targets? If Master Sergeant Rodriguez doesn't mind me taking time away from my regular duties, I'd be glad to help, Eddie replied, looking questioningly at Rodriguez. Rodriguez didn't hesitate. Consider yourself temporarily assigned to this training exercise. Your supervisor will hear from me personally about your contributions here. 1. Over the next several hours, the team systematically engaged all 3 targets, with Eddie providing guidance on timing, environmental observation, and the subtle art of reading conditions that weren't quantifiable by instruments. Each Marine took multiple shots, not just to confirm their accuracy, but to develop their own ability to see what Eddie was teaching them. By late afternoon, when Eddie indicated that conditions were optimal for engaging the 1,500-meter target, the transformation in the team's confidence was remarkable. They had moved from frustrated confusion to excited mastery of new skills that would serve them throughout their careers. But the most significant moment came when Rodriguez made an unexpected suggestion. Eddie, I know you said your shooting days were behind you, but would you consider demonstrating these techniques yourself? Show us how someone with your experience would engage these targets? Eddie hesitated, his face showing uncertainty for the first time all day. Sir, I appreciate the confidence, but it's been 40 years since I fired a military rifle. My eyes aren't what they used to be, and my hands aren't as steady as they once were. Just one shot, Rodriguez pressed gently. Pick whichever target you think gives you the best chance of success. Show these Marines what 40 years of thinking about the problem looks like in practice. Eddie looked at the assembled team, seeing the expectation in their faces. These young warriors had trusted him enough to change their approach based on his guidance. Perhaps it was time to trust them enough to put his reputation on the line. Eddie stared down the valley, his mind calculating factors that had become second nature decades ago. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains, creating the precise lighting conditions he had observed thousands of times during his maintenance rounds. His weathered hands showed none of the trembling that might be expected from a 62-year-old man who hadn't fired a rifle in 40 years. "Sir," Eddie said quietly to Rodriguez, "if I'm going to do this, I need to do it my way. Not just one target, all three. And not one shot each. One shot total." The Marines exchanged puzzled glances. Staff Sergeant Chen spoke first. "Eddie, those targets are at different ranges and locations. You can't engage all three with a single round." Eddie's eyes held a distant look, as if he were seeing something beyond the physical landscape before them. "In Vietnam, we sometimes found ourselves in situations where ammunition conservation wasn't just important, it was survival. You learned to think creatively about solutions that seemed impossible." Sergeant Williams lowered his spotting scope. "You're talking about ricochet shooting?" "That's theoretical at best, and incredibly dangerous." "Not ricochet," Eddie replied, moving toward Chen's rifle. "Alignment. May I?" Chen nodded and stepped aside, watching with fascination as Eddie examined the weapon with the practiced ease of someone who had maintained such equipment under far more difficult conditions. Eddie made minute adjustments to the scope, then settled into a shooting position that was subtly different from the techniques the Marines had been taught. His body alignment was more relaxed, his breathing pattern was slower and more deliberate, and his grip on the rifle seemed almost casual. "The key to what I'm about to attempt," Eddie explained as he prepared for the shot, "is understanding that ballistics isn't just about the trajectory of a single bullet to a single target. It's about understanding the entire environment as a three-dimensional space where physics operates according to predictable principles." Private Thompson moved closer, trying to understand what Eddie was planning. "Are you saying you can hit all three targets with one bullet somehow?" Eddie smiled slightly. "Not exactly, but I can solve the problem your team has been facing in a way that demonstrates every principle we've discussed today." He paused, studying the valley one more time. The target at 800 meters is positioned directly in line with a rocky outcropping that extends toward the 1,200-meter target. The 1,500-meter target sits at an elevation where a bullet following a specific trajectory will pass through its zone at precisely the right time. Rodriguez felt a chill of recognition. "You're planning to thread a single bullet through multiple target zones in sequence?" "More than that," Eddie replied. "I'm going to demonstrate that the environmental factors we've been discussing, the thermal currents, the air pressure variations, the temperature inversions can be used to assist rather than hinder a shot. The valley's geography creates a natural ballistic corridor at this time of day. A bullet fired with the proper trajectory and velocity will be carried by the air currents themselves." The Marines watched in stunned silence as Eddie made his final calculations. Unlike their methodical approach with instruments and charts, Eddie's preparation relied entirely on observation and intuition developed over decades of thinking about such problems. "The morning thermal currents that were disrupting your shots have evolved into predictable patterns," Eddie continued, his voice taking on the calm tone of someone entering a familiar mental state. "The airflow from the heated eastern slope creates lift at specific altitudes. The cooler air settling into the valley floor creates density layers that affect bullet drop in measurable ways." Corporal Hayes raised his spotting scope to observe the targets. "Eddie, even if everything you're saying is correct, the precision required would be beyond human capability. We're talking about minute of angle accuracy, over multiple ranges simultaneously." Eddie took a deep breath and settled his sight picture. "Son, in Vietnam we had a saying, 1 shot, 1 kill. Not because we were limited to 1 bullet, but because when it mattered most, you only got 1 chance to save lives. Everything else was practice for that moment." The rifle fired with a sharp crack that echoed off the valley walls. In the immediate aftermath, there was complete silence as the Marines processed what they had just witnessed. Eddie had fired a single round with smooth, practiced motion that seemed almost casual compared to their own intense preparation rituals. Sergeant Williams was the first to speak, his voice tight with disbelief. "Target 800 hit. Dead center." He paused, adjusting his scope to check the second target. 1,200 meters also hit. How is that possible? Private Thompson had been tracking the longest range target through his own scope. 1,500 meters confirmed hit. All 3 targets have been marked. The silence that followed was profound. Rodriguez had witnessed extraordinary marksmanship during his career, but what Eddie had just accomplished defied conventional understanding of ballistics and rifle capabilities. Eddie slowly stood up, his face showing none of the triumph that might be expected after such an achievement. Instead, he looked almost sad. "Sir, what I just did wasn't magic or superhuman skill. It was 40 years of understanding that sometimes the impossible becomes possible when you stop fighting the environment and start working with it." Staff Sergeant Chen was examining the rifle as if it might provide some explanation for what had occurred. "Eddie, I need to understand the physics of what just happened. How did one bullet engage 3 separate targets?" "The bullet didn't hit all 3 targets," Eddie explained patiently. "It passed through the scoring zone of each target in sequence. At 800 meters, it clipped the edge of the first target. The impact with that target altered its trajectory slightly, but predictably, redirecting it toward the 1,200-meter target. The environmental conditions we discussed, the thermal currents and pressure variations, guided the bullet along a path that allowed it to pass through each successive target zone." Rodriguez felt his understanding of marksmanship fundamentally shifting. "You used the valley's air currents to steer the bullet?" "I worked with forces that were already present," Eddie corrected. "The same thermal layers and pressure gradients that were causing your misses became tools once I understood how to use them. The key was timing the shot for the precise moment when all the environmental factors aligned to create a natural flight path through all 3 target zones." Corporal Hayes was still staring through his spotting scope, trying to comprehend what he had observed. The level of calculation required. "How did you process all those variables in real time?" Eddie began disassembling the rifle with the same methodical care he had shown throughout the day. "I didn't calculate anything in real time. I spent 40 years thinking about this exact scenario. Every day for 5 years, walking past this valley, I've been unconsciously analyzing the conditions and running mental simulations. When Master Sergeant Rodriguez asked me to demonstrate, I already knew what was possible at this time of day under these specific conditions." The implications of Eddie's explanation were staggering. Rodriguez realized they were dealing with someone who had developed an intuitive understanding of ballistics that went far beyond anything taught in formal military training. Private Thompson broke the contemplative silence. "Eddie, sir, what you've shown us today, this isn't just about shooting. It's about understanding systems and environments in ways that textbooks can't teach." Eddie nodded appreciatively. "That's exactly right, son. The rifle and the bullet are just tools. The real skill is learning to read the world around you and understand how all the forces work together. Most people look at a valley like this and see empty space. A sniper learns to see air currents, temperature gradients, pressure systems, and a dozen other factors that affect bullet flight." Rodriguez made a decision that would later change the way sniper training was conducted throughout the Marine Corps. "Eddie, I'm recommending you for a position as a civilian contractor instructor. What you've demonstrated today represents knowledge that could save Marines' lives in combat situations. Would you consider sharing these skills in a more formal training capacity?" Eddie was quiet for several minutes, considering the proposal. "Sir, I've spent 40 years trying to put the war behind me. Taking a teaching position would mean revisiting experiences and memories that I've worked hard to leave in the past." "I understand," Rodriguez replied. "But consider this. The knowledge you've gained from those experiences could help young Marines come home safely from future deployments. Isn't there some value in ensuring that what you learned isn't lost when your generation passes away?" The question hung in the air as the group began packing their equipment. Eddie's demonstration had solved their immediate training problem, but it had also revealed the existence of capabilities and knowledge that existed outside the formal military education system. As they walked back toward the base, Eddie finally answered Rodriguez's question. "Sir, I'll consider the teaching position, but on one condition. Any training program based on these techniques needs to emphasize that technology and instruments are tools, not replacements for understanding and intuition. The moment someone thinks they can computerize what we discussed today, they'll lose the essence of what makes it work." Staff Sergeant Chen walked alongside Eddie, still trying to process the afternoon's events. "Eddie, one more question. When you were lining up that shot, what were you thinking about?" Eddie smiled for the first time all day, a genuine expression of warmth rather than the polite courtesy he had shown throughout their interaction. "I was thinking about a 19-year-old Marine from Montana who reminded me that sometimes the old ways still work better than the new ways. And I was thinking about how proud I was to watch professionals like you learn something new and apply it immediately. That's the mark of true warriors, the willingness to admit you don't know everything and the courage to try approaches that seem impossible." As they reached the base buildings, Rodriguez realized that the day's training exercise had become something much more significant. They had not only solved their immediate problem but had discovered a teacher whose knowledge could transform their understanding of their profession. The NATO observers arriving the following week would witness demonstrations of marksmanship that exceeded anything in the official training manuals, performed by Marines who had learned to see their environment with new eyes. But more importantly, they would see evidence that the military's most valuable assets were often found in unexpected places, sometimes pushing a maintenance cart, sometimes working quietly in the background, always ready to serve when their skills were truly needed. Eddie returned to his maintenance duties, but his life had changed as fundamentally as the Marines he had taught. After 40 years of anonymity, he had rediscovered his identity as a teacher and mentor. The skills that had once been necessary for survival had found new purpose in preparing the next generation of warriors for challenges they might face in an uncertain world.